Welcome to our subplans for October 2nd, 2020. We have now covered 3 different types of factoring, and so I'm going to just review with you those 3 types, and then you will have some practice to do. Type 1, factoring out a GCF. This is where you need to look for the GCF for all of the terms in the given problem. So, if you look at -5, 35, and -30, you are trying to find what the GCF is of those numbers. The GCF of those numbers is 5, because 5 goes into all of those numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and take out a 5. Now, as far as the x's go, the first term has x to the 5th. That means that there's 5 x's there. The second term has x to the 4th, which means there's 4 x's there. And the third term has x to the 3rd, which means there's 3 x's there. So what do they all have in common? They all have the x cubed in common. Again, remember we talked about that it is always the smallest exponent of the common variable. And then you go ahead and divide 5x cubed out of each term. If it makes you feel better, you could put them off to the side and do -5x to the 5th divided by 5x cubed. That answer comes out to be -1x squared. And you would write that in the first term here. Again, you can go ahead and divide 35, x to the 4th, by the same 5x cubed. 35 divided by 5 is 7, and x to the 4th divided by x cubed is x. You can go ahead and write it here. And finally, -30 x cubed divided by 5x cubed makes -6, and you can go ahead and write it there. That is now factored. Then we saw things that have a GCF that look funny. In this next case, both of these 2 terms, and I know that there's 2 terms because there's only one main plus sign between them. These 2 terms have an m plus 7 in common. So in this particular case, you take that common group out, and then you write what's left behind after you divide it. So you'd be left with 9m squared plus 5. Then we went on to factor by grouping. Factor by grouping is when you group your 4 terms here, notice, and you group them by 2's. You're going to go ahead and take the GCF out for each of those 2 things. So, for the first 2 terms, I am seeing that I need to factor out a -14 because that is what's in common for both terms. Again, keep in mind you want at the end for the 2 groups to look the same. So when I take -14 out of these 2 terms, I am left with 2n squared plus 1. And you now get a plus 1 because you're dividing by -14. The second 2 terms have a 5n cubed in common. So I'm going to go ahead and take out the 5n cubed, and that leaves me with 2n squared plus 1 when I divide. Now I can see that I have, in between this plus sign, 2 terms, and again, there's a group in common, so I'm going to go ahead and take that group out, and I'm going to write what's left after I take it out. Let me do one more example of this. Again, we're talking about factor by grouping because there are 4 terms. I'm going to go ahead and take out the GCF for the first two terms. So what's in common between 3x cubed and negative 12x squared? Well, they're both divisible by 3 and x squared. The second two terms I also need to take out a GCF, and I notice they have a 5 in common. Now, let's pretend I don't know that there's going to be an issue here, even though I do. Let's say that I just see a 5 in common. All right, so the first two terms I take out 3x squared, because that's the GCF, and when I divide by 3x squared, I'd be left with x minus 4. The second two terms, if I take out a positive 5, I would be left with 4 minus x. Now, remember, the two groups here are supposed to look exactly alike. But notice the signs are opposite. The first one has a positive x and a minus 4. The second one has a positive 4 and a minus x. They're opposite signs. So that's my indication that instead of just taking out a 5 out of the second one, I really should be taking out a negative 5 out of the second one. My GCF should have been a negative 5. So let's go ahead and fix this now. If I take out a negative 5, it would make negative 4 plus x, which can be rewritten as x minus 4. Now the two terms are exactly the same. So now I can go ahead and take out the x minus 4, that's the same for both, and I can write what's left after I remove it. Type 3. This is the type we saw yesterday. You're looking for two numbers that multiply to make this 4, and they also have to add to make this negative 5. You have to think about these two numbers, what two numbers multiply to make 4, but add to make negative 5. And this would be negative 4 and negative 1. Now I can go ahead and factor. I'm making it look like a foil. X times x makes the x squared that's in the front. Negative 4 times negative 1 makes the positive 4 at the end. That's the last times last. And you will notice that the outer would be negative 1x and the inner would be negative 4x, and that's where the negative 5x comes from. So that's my final answer. Let's look at one more example of that. So in this next example, I would be looking for two numbers that multiply to make negative 35, and they must also add to make negative 2. You have to think about that for a second. I know that 7 times 5 is 35, but I want them to multiply to make negative 35, so one of those numbers must be negative. And I want them to add to make negative 2, so that must mean that the 7 must be negative. Now that I've got those two numbers, I can go ahead and factor. X times x makes the x squared. Negative 7 times positive 5 makes the negative 35. So last times last is working. And you notice that the outer, if we were to check this, is positive 5x, and the inner is negative 7x, and together they would make the negative 2x. So I know that I have the correct answer. Okay, so you notice now I have some practice for you. You have two Khan Academies. This one's from Khan Academy, and this one's from Khan Academy. So you're going to go ahead and do those 8 examples. These two are from Delta Math. So you want to look for the factor by grouping assignment. You can practice as many of them as you want. And you can look for the factor of x squared plus bx plus c assignment and do as many as you want. Once you feel comfortable with this concept, there is a quiz to be completed by 11:59 p.m. tonight. That quiz is on Delta Math, and you'll see the title of it, Quiz 10-20. Remember, with Delta Math, it keeps going until you go on to the next skill. I have assigned 2 problems for each of the 5 types. So once you do 2 problems of the first type, you want to go on to the second skill and do 2 problems of the second type. And so on until you have all 10 problems done from each of the 5 types. Okay? Again, this is going to be graded. So you want to make sure that you do that by 11:59 p.m. After that time, the link turns off. Okay. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.